Good morning, everyone, and welcome into this very special Earth Week conversation series with Conservation Law Foundation. Now, we're thrilled you can join us this week and hear from these influential women in literature, medicine, religion, and the youth movement who each bring a unique perspective on environmentalism. Now, it will be a wonderful conversation, and we hope you enjoy it. But if you do have any technical issues, our event manager, Katie Ardrey, is standing by to help you out. You can contact her directly via email at kardrey@clf.org. That's KARDREY@clf.org. Katie will take care of everything for you. So without further ado, I'll hand things over to our speakers and enjoy the broadcast.
Hi, everyone. My name is Priscilla De La Cruz. I am on the State Advisory Board at Conservation Law Foundation in Rhode Island. For those of you that are not familiar with CLF, we are an environmental advocacy group that uses the law, the science, and markets to create lasting solutions for New England's most critical environmental challenges. CLF works with communities to create change locally that can and will influence what's happening nationally. Today, it is my honor to introduce our guest, Elizabeth Rush, the author of Rising, Dispatches from the New American Shore. It is a beautiful human look at climate change and sea level rise through the lens of people on the front lines in coastal communities. I have to say that I luckily had the pleasure and joy of reading your book, Elizabeth, and I attended a book reading event a couple years ago, maybe in 2019. And it was also nice to briefly meet you then. So I'm really excited for our conversation today. So I thought it would be great to get started. If you could share a little bit about yourself with viewers.
Hi, thank you so much for having me here today. My name is Elizabeth Rush, and I'm the author of Rising, Dispatches from the New American Shore. I'm also a professor at Brown University, where I teach creative writing. And I have long been inspired by the question of how to write about human beings and their relationship with the more than human world in a way that will touch readers and get them ignited, active in their communities to work on behalf of people and species who aren't always the center of these conversations, these environmental conversations that we have. So that's a little bit about me. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for sharing a little bit about yourself. So want to start off with this question, keeping into perspective that environmental groups have often struggled to tell a compelling story about climate and its impact. Tell me how your book came about and how you managed to make that emotional connection to the climate crisis and sea level rise.
So it sounds like forever ago now, but I have been writing about sea level rise since about 2010, 2011. And, I covered that beat for a couple years in sort of conventional news media outlets. And I found myself growing kind of bored by the language I had to use to get these stories into the newspaper in the first place. I felt like every storm that I covered was a record-breaking storm, or there was record-breaking rain or record-breaking heat waves. And I felt like every time we spoke about climate change as another record-breaking record, we started to sort of dull readers to the dynamism at the heart of the transformations that it is bringing about. And I think it also dawned on me that often speaking in this way, or also speaking sort of statistically or putting the science front and center in these stories, really didn't leave much space for the thing that I found most compelling and most transformative as I did my reporting, which was sitting in a stranger's living room and listening to the very specific ways that climate change, and in particular sea level rise, was causing them to rethink their relationship to their home place, rethink their relationship to their communities, rethink their idea of what justice might look like going forward. And so Rising came about really as a response to my frustration with mainstream news media coverage of climate change and the stories that the environmental movement has often told about climate change, which can too often focus on either like, select keystone species, like the polar bear. And I think that there's a lot of sort of climate cliches out there. And so I wanted to fight against those. And that's how Rising came into the world. It was an active response against those narratives.
I truly love that, bringing the human people element to it. And I have to say, I truly could not put your book down when I started reading it. And I had that first reaction when colleagues were circulating the book of like, oh, about sea level rise. I'm like, yet again, something else about sea level rise that's going to get into the data and the science. But the second I started reading your book, I was like, this is just what I've been looking for. It was just so engaging. So thank you for your beautiful work and the great stories you shared. So viewers might not know this. You grew up in this region, and you mentioned early in the book about coming back to Rhode Island and that it had changed so dramatically from when you were a child. You wrote, over the past 200 years, Rhode Island has lost over 50% of its tidal marshes due to diking and developing. What does this mean for those of us living here in the Ocean State today?
Well, I want to say one thing which sort of relates to your first question and ties it to this question. You point out in the way you're posing this question that I'm a character in this book, right? Like I talk about coming back to Rhode Island. I talk about coming back to New England. And I want to say, that's also a technique to get people to pay attention to this story in a different way. I took some cues from writers that I really admire, like Eula Biss or Maggie Nelson, that are writing about big issues like vaccination or queer family making, but they're not doing it from a theoretical or historical or scientific perspective. They're kind of mixing all three of those narratives together with their own personal narrative through the set of questions that this large, seemingly large, sort of difficult to wrestle topic brings up. And I think that's because as readers, we really like voyeuristically peering into the intimate life of the author. So thanks for the first question. And the second question is about like, what is it like to return to Rhode Island? What is it like to return to New England and to recognize, to see in it a place that is not just like this static landscape, but somewhere where we used to have a lot more wetlands than we have today. I came back to this region with this wetlands awareness, having worked on sea level rise elsewhere. And with the knowledge that wetlands are sort of our most vulnerable landscapes, they're the places that are showing the early impacts of sea level rise. And one thing that I didn't know is that we also have vulnerable communities often living atop these landscapes that are former wetlands. So when you say we have 50% of Rhode Island's wetlands have been, drained, diked, developed over the last 200 years, that can mean, a place like downtown Providence, the Great Salt Cove that was in downtown Providence that we now have, the Providence Place Mall and a bunch of downtown sits on top of land that was previously a wetland. That can also mean, lower income working class communities in Pawtuxet that can live on top of land that once was deemed unfit for human use, that once flooded, twice daily with the tides, right? So I think it's really important to understand the way that these sort of pre-industrial landscapes shape our present day vulnerability. And if that hurricane barrier wasn't in place in Providence, that area downtown, huge sections of downtown would flood all the time.
Yeah, and it's I cannot help but to think about certain things that we don't stop and think about on a daily basis, like when going to downtown and looking at that hurricane barrier. So thank you very much for those points. So one of the things that I've discussed with friends and colleagues who read your book is we just wonder, how did you go about finding the people and communities in your book that could really paint and the impact of sea level rise on coastal communities, and getting them to share their stories and let you also then share their stories?
Well, that's a lot of questions in one question, but I'm going to do the best I can to answer them. The first place that I went looking for stories of sea level rise in the United States was the Louisiana Bayou. And that's because, that's very low lying land. And a lot of it has subsided significantly over the last 80 years because of the damming of the Mississippi. Those dams withhold silt behind each of them, land replenishing silt, which means that you have land subsidence. At the place where the Mississippi meets the Gulf of Mexico. So you have this sort of pre-existing condition that makes that land extra, extra vulnerable to sea level rise. So I went down to the Louisiana Bayou and I ended up spending a lot of time in a coastal community called the Isle de Jean Charles that is inhabited by Biloxi, Chitimacha, Choctaw people. And I spent a couple months there. So, I'll pause here and say, like, how did I work with folks to get them to a place where they'd be happy sharing their stories with me? And also having their stories, shared in this larger way through this book. It's really been about building relationships from day one. Whenever I was writing a grant to go somewhere, my biggest line item expense was like 3 months trailer rental through Airbnb, 2 months campground site at a local park. I wanted more than anything time to get to know people, time to work in these places. A couple of the communities, Staten Island and Maine, are communities that I actually lived in for years while I reported on them. So it's a book that took me 8 years to write. And that time that it took to write it really is about the relationships that I built along the way. And then if we kind of return back to the story of Louisiana, after I left the Isle de Jean Charles, I went back to New York City and Hurricane Sandy happened. And I was teaching at the College of Staten Island, and I could see that a lot of my students were displaced by the storm, and a lot of them lived in these working class communities. And a lot of the post-storm coverage really didn't talk about what it was like to have to keep making a life after the storm. A lot of my students stopped coming to class because they got displaced and lived in temporary FEMA housing and had to make the choice, do I keep working or go to school? And school took a back seat to financial security. And I think with that experience coupled with the Louisiana experience, I started to go, wait a minute, the places that are flooding today are not just wealthy enclaves of second homes on, barrier islands. These are also places where real people live year round who can't afford in any financial, physical, emotional sense, the profound disruption that comes with these storms. And so then I started to sort of create a new lens as I kept working on the book. I started to say, I'm going to look for vulnerable human communities married to vulnerable landscapes. And that's kind of how I started to choose the places where I was going to work. And figuring out how to identify communities that are sort of on climate change's front lines was a lot harder to do like 5-7 years ago. But today we have really cool software through something called Climate Central that lets you map social vulnerability, financial vulnerability on top of sea level rise vulnerability. So you can put in your town and see who's most vulnerable to flooding and then who has these pre-existing vulnerabilities sort of eating away at their ability to come back after those floods. Definitely check it out. Climate Central Surging Seas application. Very useful.
I definitely want to check it out. Thank you for that. And I love how you talked about what surprised you when doing your research and how then you used what you were learning to really get even more intentional about the research when it comes to how frontline communities and those that are most vulnerable year round are being impacted. So I want to ask this follow-up question. Were there any assumptions you had going into it that you had to think when sitting down to write the book?
I think that was one of the first assumptions. I thought, like, okay, I'm going to write a book. I didn't even think I was going to write about a book. I thought I'm going to report on sea level rise. And I thought I was going to deal with wealthy communities who could afford sort of innovative adaptation solutions. And I thought it was going to be like maybe a little bit about this sort of wonky, how do we design our way out of this problem? And I quickly learned that that assumption does not hold true. There's like something like 520 miles of coastline in New York City, and only about 5 miles of coastline have been buttressed by something called the Big U, which is like the multi-million-dollar design project that went in after Sandy and is really sort of like a glove that they've seated around the lower tip of Manhattan, and it's got landscape berms that double as habitat supports and skate parks and pop-up cafes. So that kind of solution, New York City, this incredible mecca of wealth, can only afford to put that in place for a tiny, teeny fraction of their coastline. I thought I was going to see a lot more of those solutions, and I started to learn how expensive they are and how out of reach they are for most communities. I think the other major assumption that I had was that, if you flood more than twice, you leave. And I learned fundamentally in writing this book that everyone's path through flooding, through storm recovery, and through into out of that thorny question of whether you stay or go is an individual decision. We can put policies in place that make pathways towards more just recoveries possible, but anytime anyone feels like decisions are being made for them, they will experience those storms as a trauma. And if they feel like they are making many small decisions along the way and taking agency over their storm experience, they'll experience that as a transformation, an opportunity for transformation. So I think that's probably the thing that surprised me the most, is that there is no way to predict or determine how you want people to act once their lives have been fundamentally upended by climate change. What you really want to do is empower them to make decisions that continue to serve them after the storm.
Wow, that's such a strong point. And we talked about frontline communities. So in your book, when often talking about people in frontline communities, that there's this question about climate change, even as they witness firsthand the impact of it. Can you give us some insight into what you learned from these communities, and how can an advocacy group like CLF learn from that as we talk about the issue?
Yeah, I think it makes me think of a very specific anecdote, which is, about Oakwood Beach, a community in Staten Island that is, right-leaning, was climate change denying, really, in I don't want to say everyone denied climate change, but let's say in a general way, there were more climate change deniers than not in Oakwood Beach. And they flooded horribly during Sandy. They flooded horribly during Irene the year before. They had these huge rainstorms a couple years before that. And it's a community, it's an environmental justice community. They're situated alongside a sewage treatment plant. And, working class, a mixture of white working class and immigrants. And, when I started reporting on them, and I shouldn't even say reporting on, spending time in Oakwood Beach and talking to folks, the narrative I would hear often was, I'm flooding worse and worse, but I don't want to say that it's climate change because I'm not a scientist. Or I know that there's been a lot of additional development in the neighborhood, and that's also a source of our flooding. We've got, more porous surfaces. Or I'll tell you what the real problem is. The city doesn't fix our flooded streets. The city doesn't help us come back after the flood. So there was a general sort of like swerving around the question of climate change. And the folks in this community after Hurricane Sandy had had enough flooding, and they came together and they petitioned the state to purchase and demolish their homes. They said, we don't feel safe living here anymore. We want to move to higher ground. And eventually Governor Cuomo agreed to do that. And after Sandy, he purchased and demolished 600 homes on the eastern shore of Staten Island. And I went back about 2.5 years after the bulk of those demolishments. And I had lunch with the 3 community leaders who are really responsible for getting the buyout, getting the state to agree to purchase these homes. And as it turned out, many of them lived within 5 miles of the homes that originally flooded. They were up and out of the floodplain, but they still went to the same butchers. They still went to the same grocers. They still hung out with each other on the weekend. What had changed was their vulnerability to flooding. And they got to choose what they wanted to do, right? They found a solution that they thought would work for them. They advocated for it. The state agreed, and they won the right to move. And I asked those community leaders, there was now a big flood wall project that was going to go into the eastern side of Staten Island. And I said to them, what do you think of the new seawall that's going in? And I'll never forget, Joe Tyrone said to me, oh, well, that's just a temporary solution. Seas are going to keep rising, and the people that live behind that wall are going to be vulnerable just like we were. And I'll tell you, I was like shocked, because Joe Tyrone would have never said sea level rise like 5 years earlier. And I thought a lot about what it is that made him change his mind or come to a place of using that terminology to describe his situation. And I think the main thing that had changed was his agency over his circumstances. He didn't have to keep going back into that his flooded homes, and repairing them. He got to choose what he wanted to do as an adaptation strategy. And it didn't fundamentally change who he was, right? Like, admitting to climate change as being a force in his life didn't mean that he couldn't keep being Joe Tyrone, didn't mean that he had lost control of the story. In fact, it helped him gain control over his circumstances. And I think that's one thing that a lot of climate change deniers fear the most, is that sense of losing control. If I accept climate change as a reality, I'm not the one writing the rules anymore. And, I think you see it in frontline communities whose livelihoods are deeply tied to the earth, tied to to like a very complex set of things that climate change is fundamentally shifting. So you hear it in fishing communities, you hear it in timber communities, you hear it in communities that I can understand the way that, really accepting, owning up to the fact that the earth is changing, the climate is changing, and we're part of that, can seem really scary, because it can seem like the end of lives and livelihoods. But we also can learn from Oakwood Beach that if you accept it and have a kind of agency over what you're going to do in response, then you can get to a better place than the one you started in. And I think that's something that we need to start to think about, if we're thinking about what climate change can awaken in us, what possibilities it can awaken in us, and how to serve those frontline communities, how to shift the narrative away from this one of suffering and loss and towards one of, sort of electric possibility as well.
I truly appreciate, Elizabeth, that throughout the conversation, you keep going back to highlighting how important it is to build relationships and how key that was for your research, and also referencing that the lived experience of people that are in the front lines, and how that is data. That is data that also should be centered when looking at policy. That lived experience is that equal part in expertise with data science. So I really appreciate that. And I also, in thinking about the stories in your book, and I remember at certain points throughout the book being in tears because of the sobering stories, and really visualizing through your words how entire communities that have had to flee their home, their lands, and after living there through generations. And there was the one story about a daughter that lost her dad in Hurricane Sandy. I remember I had to like pause, take a deep breath, then go back to reading that. And in your book, you wrote that by 2050, there will be 200 million climate refugees, people who are displaced from their homes because of climate. And would love to hear your thoughts about like, what do you think are some of the solutions for tackling the magnitude of that reality that's coming our way?
Well, I have sort of two responses to that question, and one is very emotional and one is very policy based. And so I think the first one, the emotional response, I go back to Nicole Montalto's story. She's the woman who lost her father during Hurricane Sandy. And she said something like, home was my house, it was my father, it was my sisters. And when my father wasn't there, it wasn't home anymore. And I think there's this sense in which, if we're talking about the large scale migration of folks away from, lowest lying land, places that are prone to, destructive wildfires, we have to start to think about and accept that our idea of what home is and where it's located, like our definition of home, is fundamentally going to change as the climate continues to change. And I think that also means recognizing that like home as, four walls and a roof with a concrete foundation that you have a mortgage on, is also a pretty new definition of home. Like we are capable of making fundamental recalibrations of what it means to relate to one another and the places where we live our lives. And so I think climate change demands that of us. When we think about policy, I think about the fact that, the US has helped relocate over the last 30 years about 44,000 people. If we kept on going at that rate with the number of people that are going to be displaced by flooding this century, it would take us something like 9,000 years to move them all. Like the scale at which we know how to do this helping people relocate thing and the scale at which it's going to be demanded of us in the next 50 years to 80 years is just like they're step changes away from one another. So there's lots of ways to think about how to start to address that at a policy-based level. One thing that I find potentially compelling is the proposal to, well, this also makes the news. It's in the news right now. We have to, I'm going to try to say this in the least wonky way possible. But if you live in a floodplain and you have a mortgage, you are required by law to have flood insurance. Our national flood insurance program is $34 billion in debt because we have historically subsidized those policies because they were sort of demanded of people who had never paid them before when the National Flood Insurance Program started in 1969. So we have tons of people living in the floodplain who don't pay the actuarial cost of insuring their parcels against flood risk. If we demanded that they start to pay the actuarial cost annually, it might mean going from paying $500 or $1,000 a year in flood insurance to something like $10,000 or $15,000 a year in flood insurance, which would displace all of those low-income, low-lying communities that we're talking about. The other side of the National Flood Insurance Program that kind of doesn't work, that totally doesn't work, is that if you flood and you get a claim, you're required by law to rebuild in place where you made that claim. So you have to go back to the flooded land and rebuild there again. That's the way the National Flood Insurance Program works. So I would love to see two things happen in that program. I'd love to start to see the relaxing of that second rule so that you don't have to rebuild on top of flood-prone land with your flood insurance claim money. We see one of the biggest costs in the National Flood Insurance Program is something called severe repetitive loss properties. And those are places that have flooded 5, 8, 10, 15 times in a number of years, and people just have to keep going back to them because this is the way we run this program. The other thing that I'd love to see happen is we can continue to subsidize flood insurance policies. And I'm thinking that maybe this is something that we're starting to see different states experiment with a little bit. Giving folks who want to receive subsidized flood insurance policies that possibility, if they also then agree to be bought out potentially after the next storm, if the storm, fundamentally floods a number of people with contiguous parcels alongside one another. I'll try to say that slightly more clearly. If you want a subsidized flood insurance policy, you sign up to potentially be part of a buyout in the future. And that gives folks time to wrap their minds around the fact that they might move in the future. And it also helps not price them out in the present day. It helps them keep affording their home in the present day. Because right now, where we're at with this discussion is simply removing some of the subsidies and then getting to the place where we have to force people to relocate because they can't afford their flood insurance. So this sort of marrying subsidized flood insurance to the potential of a buyout gives folks a little bit more agency over that process. That's where I'd like to see us headed.
And again, it sounds like going back to that human people-centered approach when making those policy decisions, and also coming to peace with the reality that that these communities are dealing with the impacts of climate change now. So really looking at it from a very pragmatic lens of like, well, what are we going to do now to help these frontline communities? And what are we also going to do with them to prepare for what's to come? And Elizabeth, I have to say, I'm sad that we're getting to the end of our time. And I know we've talked about some heavy topics when it comes to the stories in your book and also climate change. So I want to ask, what gives you hope after writing this book in conclusion?
I think the thing that gives me hope going forward is something that I definitely saw on the ground as I was reporting this book, the fact that climate change is bringing these communities together to fight for a more just storm recovery. And certainly when I started writing, I started to see that happening in individual communities all along the coastline, all along the country. And in the past couple of years, I've started to notice that these frontline communities are banding together. And we're seeing the growth of a really substantial climate action movement that puts social and environmental justice first through stuff like Sunrise. I'm also seeing the growth of a group that I absolutely adore called Higher Ground. They're the largest nationwide network of flood survivors in the country, and they empower folks to learn about the science underpinning their flooding, and then advocate at the local, state, and national levels for more just flood recovery. And Higher Ground has helped communities sue unlawful wetland development. They've helped communities secure buyouts. They've helped host educational forums. And so I see in their coming together ways in which they are really taking this vulnerability and turning it into power, turning it into something that makes them stronger going forward. And that's definitely my source of hope, the thing that keeps me buoyant.
Oh, I love those words, taking that vulnerability and turning it into power. I mean, that is inspiring me. So thank you so much, Elizabeth Rush, and thank you for joining CLF in this very special Earth Day conversation with leaders and influencers across New England. And I want to also thank all of the viewers who joined us today for this great conversation.
Thank you, Priscilla. It's been a pleasure, and happy Earth Day, everyone.
Thank you so much for tuning into CLF's special Earth Week conversation series. Now, we're thrilled to be celebrating the 51st Earth Day with you. Now, remember, you can tune in at 10 a.m. Monday through Thursday this week and hear from all 4 of our speakers. Just use the link in our confirmation email to tune in again tomorrow. And as always, the conversation does not end here. Sign up for CLF's e-news by going to www.clf.org so you can stay informed and take action. You can also support CLF by donating just below this video player. A gift at any level drives our work throughout New England forward. Thank you, and we'll see you tomorrow.